The first reading is a poem by the poet Barbara Crooker called Listen. She says, "Listen, I want to tell you something. This morning is bright after all the steady rain, and every iris, peony, rose opens its mouth, rejoicing. I want to say, wake up. Open your eyes. There's a snow-covered road ahead, a field of blankness, a sheet of paper, an empty screen. Even the smallest insects are singing, vibrating their entire bodies, tiny violins of longing and desire. We were made for song. I can't tell you what prayer is, but I can take the breath of the meadow into my mouth, and I can release it for the leaves' green need. I want to tell you, your life is a blue coal, a slice of orange in the mouth, cut hay in the nostrils. The cardinal's red song dances in your blood. Look, every month the moon blossoms into a peony, then shrinks to a sliver of garlic, and then it blooms again." We got a preview of the morning's Bible reading in our opening sentences. And yes, it does have a lot of place names that are a little bit tricky. What I always tell people when they read things like this in public is just pronounce it like you know what you're saying, and no one will know the difference. Now you're going to know the difference. I'm just projecting confidence. This is the second chapter of Acts, and it starts after Jesus has taken his leave from the disciples. They're gathered together in a small room during a festival, a harvest festival, which is what Pentecost is. It's the Greek name for the Hebrew festival of Shavuot. It says, when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like a rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues like tongues of fire appeared among them. A tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now, there were devout Jews from every people under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in their native language. They were amazed and astonished and asked, "Are not all of these who are speaking from Galilee?" That's a biblical, it's like the biblical version of calling them rednecks. Are they not all from Galilee? How is it that we hear each of us in our own native languages? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, visitors from Rome, people born Jewish, people who've converted, Cretans and Arabs in our own languages. We hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. All of them were amazed and perplexed, and they said to one another, "What does this mean?" And some of them sneered and said, "They're just drunk." Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "People of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you. Listen to what I say. These people are not drunk, like you're saying. It's only 9 a.m. This is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. Upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I'll pour out my spirit, and they'll prophesy. Now I will show signs in the heavens above, signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun will be turned to darkness, and the moon will be red like blood before the coming of the great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on God's name shall be saved." That's the reading for the day. Ming Li Hui came to this country from Hong Kong in 2004. I was reading about her this week in the New York Times. She was at that time a desperate 24-year-old, uncertain what her future held. She came here and landed in Kennett, Missouri. a little farming town, where her Cantonese name, Ming Li, sat oddly when she heard it coming from the mouths of native Missourians. But she'd grown up in Hong Kong and was alive when it was still under British rule. So as a kid, she had chosen an English name, Carol. That's how she started introducing herself to everyone. She was here on a tourist visa, but after about a year, she paid a native-born American citizen about $2,000 to enter into a sham marriage with her. Her hope was that she could become a permanent resident and then fly back to Hong Kong, where her grandmother was dying, and then still be able to re-enter the country. That marriage ended with a divorce in 2009, which put her immigration status into a legal gray area. She applied for asylum. In her report, she said that her mother had abused her and threatened her life simply because she was a girl. Her request was denied in 2012, but she was staying in the country under a series of temporary permissions. And she has been a model citizen of Kennett. She and her long-term partner, who was from Guatemala, they're raising 3 kids here, all of them born here. The eldest graduated from middle school this year, highly decorated student, having won numerous awards. Ming Li works 3 jobs. She starts the day at a local Waffle House. She finishes the day at a local steakhouse. And then on the side, she cleans houses. The family shows up every Sunday at the local Catholic church. Earlier this year, both Ming Li and her partner formally converted to Catholicism. She joins her neighbors to cheer on their kids at Little League games and at soccer games. And one morning early last month, she didn't show up for her shift at the diner. Her coworkers and her neighbors would later find out that she had been summoned to the ICE office in St. Louis, which is about a 3-hour drive away. When she had gotten to the office, agents put her in a private room and told her that someone was going to help her obtain her passport. But then they came back and told her that her expired tourist visa meant that she was going to be deported instead. So instead of passport help, she was put into jail. This story has a happy-ish ending, at least for the moment. When her community found out what had happened, people sprang into action. They organized, they called, they raised funds. Her church organized a prayer vigil and organized meal deliveries to her family. Other churches in the community put her name and the family's name on their prayer lists. The Waffle House had a fundraiser they called Carol Day, and they raised nearly $20,000. They had petitions on every table calling for her release, and the servers, her colleagues there at the Waffle House, swapped out their usual uniform shirts for black shirts that had big gold print on them, "Bring Carol home." And earlier this week, she was released, which isn't the end of the story, but at least she is back with her family and her community. There's an irony to this story. Kennett, Missouri, population 10,000, a farming town in the boot heel of the state, voted about 80% for the current president. Ming Li's religious sponsor at the Catholic Church, the woman who shepherded her through the formal conversion process, probably expresses this irony best, or embodies this irony best. She's quoted in the paper saying, "I voted for Donald Trump, and so did practically everyone here. But no one voted to deport moms. We were all under the impression we were just getting rid of the gangs, the people who came here in droves. This is Carol." That's the trick, isn't it? It's a lot easier to support dehumanizing policies when they're put into practice against abstractions. ideas, images. Maybe you can ignore any underlying sense of unease about a political convention where people wave signs saying mass deportations now, when the targets of those signs are rhetorical creations like gangs and murderers and violent criminals, instead of flesh and blood human beings who are your neighbors in your community. But then one of those neighbors who serves you waffles and gives you hugs and sings and prays next to you in church on Sundays and screams like crazy when your kid scores a goal, your neighbor whose garden you've admired for every summer for the past 20 years is arrested and threatened with deportation and taken from her family, and you've got to reckon with what you helped create. The current regime has made chaos its central governing principle. It's a chaos that helps to make their seemingly bottomless corruption possible, even while hiding it from some of the people who are its primary victims. A chaos that feeds on the lives of flesh and blood human beings and communities and the natural world. Our Bible reading today offers us a picture of a different kind of chaos, one that is life-giving and holy. But I want to pay attention to just one aspect of it. The book of Acts is an insider's version of the Jesus movement. It's an insider telling the story to give an accounting of how a few dozen followers of a charismatic leader transformed into something much larger after he was no longer physically present with them. This episode begins with chaos, a violent wind, flames. We've got a couple fans. I don't want to set anything on fire. That's it's bad for the insurance policy. But there is a chaos embedded in this reading that is a life-giving chaos. It's the story of a community gaining a vision that illuminates its own power and its purpose. It's set during a major pilgrimage festival, when lots of extra people came into the city of Jerusalem. But the people at the heart of the story aren't actually pilgrims. If you remember that list of complicated place names, the Parthians and Medes and the Elamites, the Phrygians, the Pamphylians, the people from every nation under heaven, which really for the author mostly meant people living from all the different parts that Rome had colonized. Interesting point to think about. But it said they were living in Jerusalem, which means that the story of Christianity, at its outset, is fundamentally a story about immigrants. And that this defining moment, this explosion of creative and generative energy, it imprints hospitality on the DNA of this newly formed church. They each heard in their own language. They were beloved as they were, because of, not in spite of, the traits and the characteristics that helped to make them who they were. God spoke in their own language to invite them in. This is not the story that's told by predominant forms of American Christianity these days. We could stand to pay a lot closer attention to the stories of our origins. We could also stand to pay closer attention to the stories of the natural world. This week I read something that actually blew my mind. I mean, figurative sense, no bleeding out of my ears or anything. It's a story from several years ago that I had not read before, and it astounded me. A report published in 2018 details how scientists at Tel Aviv University did some experiments on flowers called evening primroses. They exposed them to several different sounds. They put them in 5 different groups to expose them to sounds. One of them got the Simon and Garfunkel treatment. They exposed them, they put them under kind of soundproof glass and gave them the sound of silence. Sorry, I didn't even have that written down. It was just in the moment, which is where my worst jokes come from. 2 other groups were exposed to computer-generated sounds that were kind of medium frequencies and high frequencies. All 3 groups of evening primroses showed exactly the same result, which was there wasn't any result. Nothing really changed in the things that they were measuring about the plants. But there were 2 other groups of these evening primroses. For one group, the researchers played recordings that were equivalent to the sound of honeybees, buzzing honeybee wings, about 4 inches away from the flowers. And the other group got also computer-generated sounds that were lower, at the kind of a similar frequency to the buzzing of a honeybee's wings. And for both of these groups, the sugar concentration in the nectar of the flowers increased in as little as 3 minutes. In some of them, the nectar was measured at 65% sweeter. And then it ebbed back down after the sounds had stopped, which means essentially that the plants can hear, that they understand the language of honeybee wings, that they create a welcoming environment because they know at a cellular level that they and the bees both benefit. It's a miniature Pentecost played out again and again and again every spring. Look, I know that the flowers don't really have ears. The idea that they're hearing the way that we usually think about that term can only be used as a metaphor, and every metaphor has its limits. I also know that the natural world is more than just a series of metaphors for our edification. And there are a lot of them that I don't want to use for our social life. You're not going to hear me drawing too many lessons around tapeworms or parasitic wasps, although maybe that is the current political circumstance right now. But what if we think of the Spirit as a honeybee anyway? What if we think of her as a primrose? What if, I say this as an allergy sufferer, what if our sneezes are explosions of praise? No, I'm kidding. I'm not giving up my Zyrtec as a religious practice or anything. But I mean, the primrose picks up the meaning of the honeybee's buzz and offers the best nectar that it can produce. The honeybee thanks the primrose by pollinating and cross-pollinating. They are dependent upon each other. They work together in partnership. And as they do so, they both become part of an ecosystem that supports other forms of life. Is that not a model of the Spirit's movement among us and a vision that we can aspire to? We bring our needs and our gifts. I offer what I have, and I receive what you offer, and together we all are enlarged. It's the opposite of the narratives that we're fed these days by a regime that stokes fear to cover evil. It's a Pentecost of sweetness, a Pentecost of abundance, and that is God's good news. Amen.